Each year, naval forces across the globe document hundreds of incidents involving unexplained acoustic phenomena in deep ocean waters, strange readings on sonar equipment that defy conventional scientific explanation, and psychological breakdowns among experienced sailors that military psychiatrists struggle to categorize using standard diagnostic criteria. The phenomenon occurs so frequently in specific maritime regions that NATO maintains a classified division within its Undersea Research Center, allocated approximately $340 million annually, dedicated exclusively to investigating what internal documents refer to as deep-frequency anomalies and their devastating effects on naval personnel who've been exposed to certain experimental chemical agents during wartime operations. The Battle of the Atlantic, which raged from 1939 to 1945, saw over 36,000 merchant seamen perish in the freezing waters between North America and Britain, with German U-boats sinking more than 3,500 Allied vessels in what became the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. And it was precisely in these hostile waters where desperation drove both sides to experiment with weapons that blurred the line between science and something far darker. That certain incidents occurred which would forever change how naval intelligence agencies approach the intersection of chemical warfare and unexplained mass psychological events. For a brief period during March of 1943 in a sector of the North Atlantic, known ominously as the Black Gap, where no air coverage existed and submarines ruled the depths, the crew of HMS Relentless would encounter something so extraordinarily terrifying aboard a drifting Norwegian cargo vessel that it would result in the complete erasure of 144 men from official military records, as if they had simply been swallowed by the ocean itself, and the very mention of their names became a security liability. But what exactly was the German experimental nerve agent known as Projekt Sirenenlied that made hardened combat veterans willingly walk into freezing Atlantic waters with expressions of pure serenity on their faces? And why did the British Admiralty immediately order the incineration of all physical evidence, while simultaneously establishing permanent sonar monitoring stations in that exact coordinates that remain operational and heavily classified to this very day? The North Atlantic's Black Gap stretched across approximately 600 nautical miles of open ocean, positioned roughly 800 kilometers west of Ireland's coastline, where the curvature of the Earth and the limited range of 1940s aircraft created a deadly blind spot that German U-boat commanders exploited with ruthless efficiency throughout 1942 and early 1943. This particular region of the Atlantic possessed unique characteristics that made it especially treacherous. Water temperatures hovered between 2 to 4 degrees Celsius year-round, cold enough to kill an unprotected human being through hypothermia in approximately 15 to 30 minutes, while the ocean floor plunged to abyssal depths exceeding 4,000 meters in certain trenches, creating underwater topography so complex that sonar equipment of the era frequently produced readings that experienced operators described as impossible, or like the ocean itself is screaming back at us. The combination of these extreme depths, frigid temperatures, and the psychological weight of operating in waters where hundreds of ships had already been sent to the bottom created an environment where even the most rational minds could begin to perceive things in the endless gray waves that perhaps weren't entirely explicable by exhaustion or stress alone. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that this particular stretch of the Atlantic would become the epicenter for incidents that naval historians would later struggle to classify events where the official reports seemed deliberately incomplete, as if whoever compiled them couldn't quite bring themselves to document what had truly been witnessed in those cold, dark waters, where the line between the living world and whatever lay beneath grew dangerously thin. Long before the advent of modern naval warfare, this region of the North Atlantic had earned itself a dark reputation among sailors that stretched back centuries, with Icelandic sagas from the 12th century, making reference to a phenomenon the Norse called hafgufa, or sea mist, describing how entire Viking longships would encounter banks of reddish fog that rose from the depths and left crews in a trance-like state, with survivors later found having walked overboard in their sleep, their faces bearing expressions that witnesses described as injalar, which roughly translates to peaceful as those entering Valhalla. Irish monks who mapped these waters in the 9th century recorded in Latin texts preserved at Trinity College Dublin accounts of what they termed Cantus Abyssi, or Song of the Abyss. He detailed descriptions of low-frequency sounds that seemed to emanate from beneath their vessels during certain months. Sounds that allegedly drove 3 separate monastic crews to deliberately scuttle their own ships, while claiming they were answering the call of the depths where God's light cannot reach. Even more disturbing were Ottoman naval records from the 16th century, when Turkish vessels operating in the northern Atlantic documented incidents of crews affected by what they called Derinden Gelen Çağrı, or the call from below, with ship's doctors noting that afflicted sailors would first complain of hearing beautiful music, then would develop an overwhelming compulsion to reach the source of the sound, and finally would throw themselves into the ocean with what observers consistently described as expressions of religious ecstasy, as if they believed they were going home rather than to their deaths. The consistency of these historical accounts across vastly different cultures and time periods, all describing essentially the same progression of symptoms in the exact same geographic region, suggested something far more substantial than mere superstition or collective delusion. Modern military encounters with unexplained phenomena in this region began as early as World War I, when in November of 1917, the British Q-ship HMS Candytuft reported via emergency wireless that approximately half her crew of 63 men had succumbed to a form of mass hysteria after passing through what the ship's log described as an unusual reddish discoloration in the water, origin unknown, accompanied by a pervasive sweet odor similar to decay and honey mixed together, with the captain's final transmission stating that affected crew members were attempting to throw themselves overboard while claiming they could hear singing from below the keel. The vessel was found 3 days later completely abandoned, drifting with all lifeboats still secured in their davits. The only clue to the crew's fate being dozens of sets of footprints on the deck leading to the railings, but none leading back, and curious scorch marks on the ship's bell as if it had been wrung so violently and repeatedly that the metal had actually warped from the friction. During the interwar period, at least 7 documented incidents occurred in the Black Gap, involving merchant vessels whose crews reported hearing music or voices emanating from the ocean, with 3 of these ships later discovered as ghost ships with reduced crews or no crews at all, and in each case survivors who were eventually recovered described identical symptoms. First the pleasant smell, then the irresistible music, then the overwhelming compulsion to enter the water. Similar encounters were reported by German naval forces as early as 1940, with at least 2 U-boats sending fragmentary transmissions about crew members being affected by unknown atmospheric conditions before contact was permanently lost, and declassified Kriegsmarine documents from 1941 revealed that the German Navy had actually established a secret research program specifically to investigate acoustic anomalies with psychological warfare potential after multiple submarine commanders reported that certain areas of the North Atlantic seemed to produce naturally occurring sounds that had profound effects on human consciousness. These historical precedents created a disturbing pattern, one that suggested whatever was about to unfold aboard HMS Relentless in March of 1943 was not an isolated incident, but rather the latest manifestation of something ancient and persistent that had been claiming sailors in these waters for over 1,000 years. March 14, 1943, 0317 hours. Greenwich Mean Time, and the communications room aboard HMS Relentless sat in relative quiet, save for the constant crackling of radio static and the rhythmic ping of the ASDIC sonar system echoing through the destroyer's steel hull as she maintained her patrol pattern through the Black Gap. Leading radio operator Thomas Wickham, a wiry 34-year-old veteran from Portsmouth who'd survived the evacuation of Dunkirk and still carried shrapnel scars across his left shoulder, was midway through his night watch when his equipment suddenly erupted with a transmission so fragmented and panic-stricken that he initially believed it was German psychological warfare, some new trick to draw Allied vessels into U-boat kill zones. The voice that came through, breaking international protocol by transmitting in clear English rather than code, carried a Norwegian accent thick with terror and kept repeating coordinates 52 degrees north, 30 degrees west, approximately 15 nautical miles from HMS Relentless's current position, and the words that Wickham would later struggle to include in his official report without sounding like he'd lost his mind. They're jumping. Christ Jesus, they're all jumping. The music, and don't listen to the music. The captain put a bullet in his head to stop hearing it. SOS. SS Margaret. Whatever you do, don't breathe the red mist. Captain James Arthur Thornton, 48 years old, a granite-faced career naval officer who'd commanded destroyers since 1938, and who carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who'd witnessed the carnage of Jutland as a young midshipman back in 1916, arrived on the bridge within 2 minutes of being summoned, his gray eyes immediately scanning the tactical map while his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander David Reynolds, a former mathematics professor from Cambridge who'd volunteered in 1939 and who approached naval warfare with an almost academic precision, attempted to raise the distressed vessel on multiple frequencies without success. The air temperature on the bridge read 4 degrees Celsius. The ocean outside was a black expanse punctuated only by whitecaps that glowed eerily in the moonlight, and as Thornton gave the order to alter course toward the Margaret's last known position at flank speed, none of the 195 men aboard HMS Relentless could have possibly understood that they were steaming directly towards something that would challenge every assumption they held about the nature of reality sanity and what exactly dwelled in the lightless depths 4,000 meters below their keel. By 05:20 hours, with dawn still an hour away and the North Atlantic shrouded in a fog so thick that visibility had dropped to less than 200 meters, the ASDIC operator reported a stationary contact dead ahead, and as HMS Relentless slowed to approach speed, her massive forward searchlight suddenly pierced the gray mist to reveal the SS Margaret, wallowing in the gentle swell. The 14 bodies standing at the starboard railing weren't corpses in the traditional sense, though they had clearly been dead for at least 12 hours, based on the rigor mortis that held them upright and the frost that had formed on their clothing and exposed skin in the frigid Atlantic air. But what caused Lieutenant Carter to actually vomit into his gas mask, requiring him to tear it off? Gasping was the fact that every single one of these dead men was smiling, not grimacing in death agony, or frozen in expressions of terror, but genuinely, peacefully smiling like children who'd fallen asleep while dreaming of something wonderful. Their eyes were open, staring down at the black water below with what could only be described as longing. And several of them had tears frozen on their cheeks, crystallized trails that caught the boarding party's torchlight tears that had clearly been shed while they were dying of hypothermia. And Seaman Aldrich, who was examining the body of a young Norwegian sailor, who couldn't have been more than 19, noticed that the dead man's lips were moving, actually physically moving, despite the rigor mortis, the frozen jaw working soundlessly, as if still trying to sing along with whatever music he'd been hearing when he died. Inside the Margaretta's bridge, the scene was even more disturbing. Captain Sven Nielsen's body sat slumped in his chair, a Luger pistol still clutched in his right hand, the back of his skull blown out across the navigation charts behind him. But his left hand was frozen in the act of writing, his fingers still gripping a pencil, and his ship's log lay open to the final entry, the handwriting deteriorating from neat cursive to barely legible scrawl, the last words trailing off into a series of wavy lines as if his hand had continued moving even as consciousness fled. And the content of those final entries would make Lieutenant Carter's blood run cold as he read about the red mist rising from where they depth-charged a U-boat, about the sweet smell that had spread through the ship, about crew members beginning to hear music and then systematically throwing themselves overboard while the captain, who was partially deaf from artillery service in World War I, could only watch in horror as his entire crew succumbed to something he himself couldn't perceive. But it was what they found in the cargo hold that would ultimately doom HMS Relentless. 3 large cylindrical tanks, each approximately 2 meters tall and marked with German military stencils, one of them showing a long crack along its side with residual condensation still visible, and stenciled on each tank in neat Gothic script were the words, Projekt Sirenenlied, nur für authorized personnel, biologische Gefahr, and beneath that, painted in red, was a symbol that none of them recognized at the time, but that would haunt their nightmares afterward, a stylized image of a woman with a fish's tail, her mouth open as if singing, and beneath her, reaching up from stylized waves, were hundreds of skeletal hands. By 06:45 hours, Lieutenant Carter's boarding party had returned to HMS Relentless with Captain Nielsen's log, several classified German documents retrieved from the cargo hold, and photographic evidence of the cylindrical tanks. But what they'd also brought back unknowingly absorbed into their uniforms and equipment, and the very moisture of their lungs were microscopic crystalline particles of Projekt Sirenenlied that had been slowly sublimating from the cracked cylinder for nearly 48 hours. Captain Thornton immediately convened an emergency meeting in the wardroom with his senior officers, including Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, the ship's medical officer Dr. Philip Ashford, who was a 42-year-old former psychiatrist from London with extensive experience treating shell-shock cases, and the ship's engineering officer Commander Robert Shaw, a meticulous Scotsman who'd worked in chemical manufacturing before the war and who took one look at the photographs of the German tanks and went visibly pale. Thornton's first instinct was to follow proper protocol, transmit the discovery to Admiralty Command, request instructions regarding the dangerous cargo aboard the Margaret, and maintain a safe distance from the derelict vessel until specialized personnel could arrive. But when radio operator Wickham attempted to send the encrypted transmission, he found that all long-range communications had mysteriously degraded, the radio producing nothing but a strange warbling static that seemed to pulse in regular intervals, almost like a heartbeat. And even more disturbing was the report from the ASDIC operator, who stated that his sonar equipment was picking up multiple returns from the deep water directly beneath both ships' contacts that appeared and disappeared in patterns that made no sense, as if something massive was circling in the abyss 4,000 meters down, rising and falling, but never breaking the surface. Dr. Ashford, meanwhile, had begun examining the boarding party members as a precautionary measure, and within the first 20 minutes of examinations, he noticed something that made his hand start to tremble. Seaman Aldrich, the young man with the acute hearing, had a resting pulse of 118 beats per minute. Despite appearing calm, his pupils were dilated to the point where the blue of his irises was barely visible. And when Ashford asked him routine questions to assess his mental state, Aldrich kept pausing mid-sentence, tilting his head as if listening to something, and finally asked in a voice that was far too casual, "Doctor, do you ever hear singing when there's no one around? Beautiful singing, like a choir, but the words aren't in any language, you know?" Commander Shaw, working in the ship's small chemistry laboratory with samples of the crystalline residue that had been scraped from the cracked German cylinder, made a discovery that caused him to immediately request a private audience with Captain Thornton, and what he revealed was so disturbing that Thornton ordered everyone present to sign additional secrecy oaths before Shaw would continue. The substance, Shaw explained while chain-smoking cigarettes with shaking hands, was unlike any chemical weapon he'd ever encountered in 12 years of studying industrial toxins. Under microscopic examination, the crystals appeared to be some kind of hybrid compound combining what looked like a sulfur mustard gas base with organic molecules he couldn't identify, but more impossibly, the crystals seemed to vibrate at a measurable frequency of approximately 19 hertz when exposed to salt water, which was below the threshold of human hearing, but which was precisely the resonant frequency known to cause feelings of anxiety, dread, and in some cases visual and auditory hallucinations in laboratory subjects. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, who'd been translating the captured German documents using his academic background in languages, had uncovered something even more chilling. The Projekt Sirenenlied had not been designed as a conventional weapon at all, but rather as what the Germans termed Wahrnehmungsverstärker, or perception amplifier, based on a series of experiments conducted in 1941, after a U-boat crew in this exact region of the Atlantic had reported hearing inexplicable sounds that had driven 3 crew members to suicide. The German research documents written by a Dr. Heinrich Vogler, who'd apparently been both a chemist and a student of ancient languages, contained disturbing references to Sumerian texts describing something called Abzugal, or Great Deep Waters, Phoenician maritime records warning of Kol HaTehom, or Voice of the Abyss, and even older Akkadian clay tablets that spoke of entities dwelling in the deepest parts of the ocean that could not be perceived by normal human senses, but which had always been there, always calling, always hungry. Most disturbing was Dr. Vogler's hypothesis, written in clinical German that Reynolds translated with increasing horror. The compound does not create the auditory phenomenon. It merely removes the evolutionary filters that prevent the human brain from perceiving frequencies that exist naturally in deep ocean environments. Test subjects exposed to Sirenenlied report hearing voices, music, and calls that compel them toward the source. The question is not whether these sounds exist, but rather what is generating them, and why human neurology evolved specifically to block our perception of them. The final page of Vogler's notes contained a handwritten addendum dated February 1943, just 1 month before, stating that the 3 prototype cylinders had been loaded aboard U-227 for transport to a secure facility in Norway. But the submarine had been damaged and forced to surface, and the last line, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, simply said, "Gott hilf uns, wir hätten niemals zuhören sollen." God help us, we should never have listened. At 08:47 hours, barely 2 hours after the boarding party had returned from the SS Margaret, the ship's master-at-arms came running to the bridge to report that Seaman Aldrich had been found standing on the forward deck in his underwear. Despite the freezing temperature, staring at the ocean and humming a melody that no one recognized, and when 2 shipmates tried to escort him below decks, he'd turned on them with such sudden violence that he'd broken one man's nose and dislocated another's shoulder before being physically restrained. By 09:20 hours, 5 more crew members had begun exhibiting similar symptoms. Able seaman Marcus Webb, a 26-year-old from Manchester who'd been part of the boarding party, was found in the ship's head, sitting naked in a cold shower and crying while repeatedly whispering, "They're calling me home, they're finally calling me home." And when Dr. Ashford tried to examine him, Webb grabbed the doctor's wrist with crushing strength and said in a voice that seemed to contain multiple tones simultaneously, "Can't you hear them, doctor? They're right below us. They've always been below us. We're the ones who are lost, not them." Lieutenant Carter himself, the officer who'd led the boarding operation, began showing signs during the morning briefing when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his eyes losing focus, and then turned to look at the starboard bulkhead as if he could see through the steel hull to the ocean beyond. And when Captain Thornton demanded to know what was wrong, Carter replied in a dreamy voice completely unlike his usual Welsh pragmatism, "Sir, I think I understand now why the Margaretta's crew looked so peaceful when they died. They weren't dying. They were finally waking up." By 10:30 hours, Thornton had ordered all affected personnel confined to the sickbay under armed guard. But the ship's medical facilities had only been designed to handle 6 patients maximum. And now they had 11 men showing symptoms, with 3 more reporting the onset of unusual auditory phenomena, and worse, the affected men had begun to synchronize their humming, all of them producing the same unearthly melody in perfect harmony, despite being isolated in separate compartments, creating a sound that resonated through the destroyer's hull and made even the unaffected crew members' teeth ache. The situation deteriorated further when Commander Shaw, conducting another analysis of the gas compound, discovered that the crystalline particles didn't merely dissipate in air as conventional chemical weapons would, but rather seemed to be attracted to moisture, meaning every breath the boarding party had taken, every surface they'd touched with damp hands, every piece of clothing that had absorbed the humid sea air had become a vector for contamination. And his calculations suggested that approximately 60% of HMS Relentless's crew had likely been exposed to some degree, with no way of predicting who would develop symptoms or when. At 11:15 hours, in an act of desperate improvisation, Lieutenant Commander Reynolds proposed using the ship's steam whistle to produce counter-frequencies that might disrupt whatever effect the gas was having on the affected crew's neurology. And they actually attempted it, blasting the whistle at varying intervals for nearly 10 minutes. But the only result was that every single one of the 11 confined men simultaneously began screaming, not in pain but in what sounded like grief, as if the whistle was somehow drowning out the music they were hearing and depriving them of something precious. And one of them, Petty Officer George Morrison, who'd served aboard destroyers for 15 years and who'd always been known for his unshakable composure, actually tore his fingernails off clawing at the sickbay door, trying to get outside where he could hear the singing, more clearly, leaving bloody streaks on the painted steel and sobbing like a child who'd been separated from his mother. At 13:47 hours, exactly 12 hours after HMS Relentless had first received the distress call from the SS Margaret, something changed in the water surrounding both vessels, a transformation so profound that even crew members who hadn't been showing symptoms suddenly felt it in their bones. A wrongness that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive parts of the human brain that still remembered when mankind's ancestors had fled from the oceans onto dry land. The Aztec operator, a steady-handed veteran named Petty Officer Ernest Blake, who'd been monitoring submarines in these waters for 3 years without incident, suddenly tore off his headphones and staggered backward from his equipment, blood trickling from both ears, stammering that something massive had just risen from the abyssal depths and was now holding position at approximately 200 meters below the surface directly beneath HMS Relentless, and the sonar return was so large that it couldn't possibly be a whale or submarine or any known underwater object, displaying as a contact roughly 150 meters in diameter that seemed to pulse and shift like it wasn't entirely solid. Within minutes, lookouts on deck began reporting a visible change in the ocean itself. The water around both ships was taking on a reddish-pink discoloration, starting as small patches but rapidly spreading until they were surrounded by what looked like a vast stain of diluted blood. And rising from this discolored water was a mist, a fog that seemed to glow faintly with its own bioluminescence, carrying with it that same sickeningly sweet smell of honey and decay that the boarding party had reported from the Margaret, but now amplified 1,000-fold until crew members were gagging and trying to breathe through cloth masks that did nothing to filter out the pervasive stench. The temperature began to drop precipitously, falling from 4 degrees Celsius to -2 in a matter of 15 minutes, cold enough that sea spray was instantly freezing on the destroyer's superstructure, and several crew members reported feeling an odd heaviness, as if gravity itself had intensified, making it difficult to stand upright and causing a sensation like their internal organs were being gently tugged downward toward the deck, toward the ocean, toward whatever was waiting in the depths below. Captain Thornton, standing on the bridge and watching his ship become enveloped in this impossible phenomenon, gave the order to start engines and get underway at flank speed. But when Commander Shaw attempted to execute the command, the engineering crew reported that the turbines were responding sluggishly, as if the ship itself had become reluctant to move. And through the speaking tubes from the engine room came panicked voices saying that the metal bulkheads were making sounds, low-frequency groans and creaks that formed almost patterns, almost words. And 3 of the stokers had already abandoned their posts and were trying to climb up to the main deck, driven by some overwhelming compulsion that they couldn't articulate except to say that they needed to be closer to the railing, closer to the water, closer to whatever was calling them home. By 1420 hours, the situation aboard HMS Relentless had deteriorated from crisis to nightmare, as the number of affected crew members jumped from 11 to 47 in less than 30 minutes, and Dr. Ashford, who was now showing early symptoms himself, based on the way he kept pausing to tilt his head as if listening to distant music, reported that the progression seemed to accelerate with exposure to the red mist, as if whatever chemical or psychological effect the Projekt Sirenenlied had initiated was now being amplified by proximity to the thing in the water below. Lieutenant Carter, who'd been confined to sick bay along with the other early cases, had undergone a disturbing transformation. His eyes had taken on a glassy, distant quality, and he no longer struggled against his restraints, but simply lay there smiling peacefully, occasionally speaking in a calm monotone about the beautiful ones, who lived in the cold, dark places where pressure could crush steel and who'd been singing since before human beings evolved the capacity to walk upright. Beings that weren't malevolent or even aware of human concepts of good and evil, but simply existed, called, waited, and collected those who could finally hear them. Seaman Aldrich, the young man with acute hearing who'd been the first to succumb, had progressed even further. He'd stopped speaking in English entirely and was now producing sounds that Dr. Ashford's notes described as phonetically impossible for human vocal anatomy, containing harmonic frequencies that seemed to originate from his chest cavity and sinuses simultaneously, creating an effect similar to Tibetan throat singing but far more complex. And when recorded and played back, the sounds register on equipment as containing subsonic components below 10 Hz that should not be perceptible, but which cause severe unease in anyone who listens. The unaffected crew members, now reduced to approximately 130 men who were desperately trying to maintain operational control of the ship, began to fracture into distinct psychological groups. Some, like Master-at-Arms Harold Grimes, argued vehemently that they should shoot the affected crew members before the condition spread further. Mercy killings that would save the ship even if it damned their souls. Others, including several of the younger sailors who'd never seen combat, had barricaded themselves in interior compartments with no portholes, irrationally convinced that simply not being able to see the ocean would protect them from whatever was happening. And a third group, led by a grizzled able seaman named Patrick O'Brien, who wore a rosary around his neck and who'd survived the sinking of 2 previous ships, had gathered in the galley where they were praying continuously in a mixture of Latin, English, and Irish Gaelic, convinced that what they were facing was demonic rather than chemical or natural, something that required spiritual warfare rather than military protocols. Meanwhile, the ship's electronic equipment had begun to behave in ways that defied technical explanation. Clocks were running backward, compasses were spinning wildly without settling on any direction, and the electrical systems were experiencing surges and drops that caused lights to flicker in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost like Morse code though, when Lieutenant Commander Reynolds attempted to decode the patterns. He found himself staring at a message that repeated over and over, "Come down, come down, come down, we are waiting, we have always been waiting." At 15:12 hours, the thing that had been holding position 200 meters below the surface began to rise, and as it ascended, the affected crew members throughout HMS Relentless responded with a collective sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, a unified exhalation that became a moan, that became a song. 47 human voices producing a harmony so achingly beautiful and simultaneously so wrong that it made unaffected crew members weep uncontrollably, even as their rational minds recoiled in horror. The ASDIC showed the massive contact at 150 meters, then 100 meters, then 50 meters, rising with impossible steadiness, and through the portholes and from the deck, crew members could now see something in the reddish water below, a shape that the human brain struggled to interpret because it seemed to shift and change moment by moment, looking at one instant like an enormous mass of translucent tentacles or fronds, then appearing to be a vast school of fish moving in perfect synchronization, then resembling nothing so much as the most beautiful woman any man had ever imagined. Multiplied by hundreds, their arms reaching upward through the water in gestures that were simultaneously welcoming and pleading, and each man who looked at it saw something slightly different, something that corresponded to his deepest longing or his most primal fear, because the thing in the water had no fixed form, but was instead a manifestation of whatever the observer's psyche most strongly responded to, a mirror held up by something that had evolved or existed long before human consciousness, and which therefore had no form of its own, but could reflect back anything a human mind needed to see in order to compel them toward it. Captain Thornton, forcing himself to look at the thing even as every instinct screamed at him to close his eyes, saw his wife Margaret, who'd died of pneumonia in 1940, standing in the water and reaching up to him with a smile on her face. Her voice carried impossibly through the steel hull saying, "James, I've been so alone. Please come be with me. The water isn't cold at all, it's warm and safe and we can finally be together." And he knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't really her, but something wearing her image like a mask. Yet the knowledge didn't diminish the overwhelming urge to simply climb over the railing and join her to sink into those arms that looked so real and so loving even though they were nothing but bioluminescent tissue from something that had never been human and never would be. The restraints in the sickbay began to fail as the affected crew members pulled against them with strength born of absolute conviction, and Lieutenant Carter, that practical Welsh officer who'd always been the epitome of level-headed competence, was the first to break free, and he didn't run or struggle but simply walked with serene purpose through the ship, shoving aside anyone who tried to stop him without even seeming to notice them. His eyes fixed on something only he could see, making his way toward the main deck, with tears streaming down his face, and a smile that looked like religious ecstasy, and behind him came the others, 11 men who'd broken their bonds and who moved in a sort of processional formation, and the horrifying thing was that they were singing. All of them singing the same impossible melody in perfect harmony, and when Master-at-Arms Grimes tried to block the passageway with his rifle, they simply walked into the muzzle as if the weapon didn't exist, forcing him to either shoot or be trampled. And after a moment of terrible indecision, he dropped the rifle and pressed himself against the bulkhead, sobbing as they passed by like a funeral march of men, who were walking willingly toward their own deaths with expressions that suggested they were finally, after years of being lost, finding their way home. At precisely 15:34 hours, just as Lieutenant Carter reached the main deck railing with his procession of 11 affected crew members following behind him in that terrible synchronized march, the eastern horizon erupted with the distinctive whistle scream of incoming naval artillery and 3 6-inch shells from HMS Valiant, a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship that had been steaming at full speed toward the last known coordinates of HMS Relentless, after Admiralty had grown concerned about the destroyer's radio silence, impacted the water approximately 400 meters from both vessels, creating massive geysers of displaced ocean and sending shockwaves through the water that were powerful enough to rattle teeth and crack several of HMS Relentless's portholes. The effect on the thing in the depths was immediate and profound. The ASDIC contact that had been rising steadily suddenly plunged downward in what Petty Officer Blake would later describe as like watching a frightened animal bolt for its den, dropping from 30 meters depth to 500 meters in a matter of seconds. And with its descent, the red discoloration in the water began to dissipate rapidly, the bioluminescent mist thinning and losing its sickly glow. And most critically, the overwhelming pressure that had been building in every conscious mind aboard the destroyer suddenly released like a pneumatic valve being opened. Lieutenant Carter, who'd had one leg over the railing and had been leaning forward to drop into the waiting arms of whatever he'd been seeing in the water below, suddenly stopped mid-motion, his eyes regaining focus. And when he looked down at the now empty ocean where moments before he'd seen something so beautiful it had been worth dying for, his face crumpled into an expression of such profound loss and confusion that Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, who'd been running toward him to attempt a physical intervention, actually felt his heart break, watching a man realize he'd been seconds away from suicide. The 11 affected crew members behind Carter had similar reactions, some collapsing to the deck and curling into fetal positions, others vomiting violently over the side, and Seaman Aldrich, the young man who'd been the first to succumb, was found unconscious with his hands clutched over his ears so tightly he'd drawn blood with his own fingernails. And when Dr. Ashford examined him, the young sailor's vital signs were so erratic that the doctor genuinely couldn't determine whether he would survive the next hour or not. HMS Valiant came alongside within 20 minutes, her commanding officer, Captain Sir Edmund Blackwood, having been informed by Admiralty intelligence that HMS Relentless had reported a German chemical weapon aboard a Norwegian vessel and then gone silent. And Blackwood had made the decision to fire warning shots to scare off any U-boats that might be lying in wait, never imagining that his shells would actually drive away something far stranger than any submarine. The survivors of HMS Relentless, those crew members who'd resisted the call or who'd been exposed to lower concentrations of the Projekt Sirenenlied compound, were in a state of collective trauma that Dr. Ashford had no adequate terminology to describe. Not quite shell shock, not quite psychosis, but something that combined elements of both along with what almost resembled grief, as if each man had lost something precious even though they couldn't articulate what that something was. And over the following hours, as the effects of the gas gradually faded from their systems, many of them would break down crying at seemingly random moments, overwhelmed by emotions they couldn't name, and mourning for a home they'd never consciously known existed until it had called to them and then been taken away. By 1720 hours, a specialized Royal Navy intelligence team had arrived via destroyer escort from the British naval base at Londonderry, led by a grim-faced commander whose name was never recorded in any official documentation, and who carried papers signed by someone in the Admiralty with authority that even Captain Sir Edmund Blackwood of HMS Valiant immediately deferred to without question. This unnamed commander, accompanied by 6 men in unmarked uniforms who moved with the efficiency of those who'd performed similar operations before, conducted a rapid assessment of both HMS Relentless and the still drifting SS Margaret, photographing the German chemical cylinders, confiscating Captain Nielsen's log and all related documents, and taking sworn statements from Captain Thornton and his senior officers that were recorded in duplicate and immediately sealed in bags marked with classification stamps that none of them had ever seen before. The decision regarding the SS Margaret was made swiftly and without consultation. At 1825 hours, a series of precisely placed scuttling charges were detonated along the Norwegian cargo vessel's keel, sending her to the bottom in less than 7 minutes. and the intelligence team ensured that she went down in one of the deepest parts of the Black Gap, settling at approximately 4,100 meters depth, where no salvage operation could possibly reach her, and where the pressure would crush the remaining chemical cylinders into fragments too small to ever pose a threat again. The 14 frozen corpses that had been standing at the Margaret's railing, those dead Norwegian sailors with their peaceful smiles and their eyes still locked on the ocean that had claimed their shipmates, went down with the vessel denied even the dignity of burial at sea, because their very existence represented evidence that couldn't be allowed to surface. And Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, who'd been forced to watch the derelict ship sink with those men still aboard, would later tell his wife that he sometimes dreamed of them still standing at that railing in the crushing darkness of the abyssal depths, still smiling, still watching, still waiting for something to call them home. The 47 crew members of HMS Relentless, who'd been most severely affected by the Projekt Sirenenlied, were separated from their shipmates under armed guard, transferred to HMS Valiant, with their hands bound and their eyes covered with blackout hoods. And Captain Thornton was informed in terms that left no room for misunderstanding that these men would not be returning to regular service, that they would be taken to an undisclosed medical facility for specialized psychiatric evaluation, and that inquiries about their status or location would be considered a breach of the Official Secrets Act, with consequences that extended to family members. Within 72 hours, families across Britain would receive carefully worded telegrams expressing regret that their sons, husbands, and fathers had been killed in action against enemy forces in the North Atlantic, honorable deaths in service of king and country, and the bodies would never be returned because they'd been buried at sea, as was proper for sailors, though in truth most of those men were alive, locked in isolated wards in a converted Victorian asylum on the Scottish coast, where psychiatrists who'd signed their own secrecy oaths attempted to understand what they had experienced and whether the damage could ever be reversed. At 20:45 hours, as the last of the intelligence team's equipment was being transferred back to their destroyer, the unnamed commander took Captain Thornton aside on HMS Relentless's bridge and spoke to him with a weariness that suggested this was not the first supernatural naval incident he'd been called to contain, explaining that similar events had occurred at least 7 times in the past 3 years, always in deep water, always involving either German experimental weapons or unexplained acoustic phenomena, and always resulting in the same pattern of crew members becoming compelled to enter the water by something they heard, but which defied conventional explanation. The commander admitted in a moment of candor that seemed to violate his own protocols that Admiralty intelligence had been tracking these incidents since 1940 and had developed a theory that certain areas of the deep ocean contained what he termed resonance zones, where the fundamental frequency of water under extreme pressure created effects on human neurology that most people never noticed, because evolution had wired our brains to filter out those frequencies, but that the German gas had removed those filters, essentially giving the affected men the ability to perceive something that had always been there, something that called and waited and collected those who could finally hear it. As the intelligence team departed, and HMS Relentless was ordered to return to port under escort, several crew members who hadn't been severely affected but who'd heard fragments of the music reported a disturbing phenomenon. When they stood at the railing and looked out at the now calm North Atlantic waters, they could still feel something down there, a presence that was aware of them, and patient something that had retreated when the artillery had frightened it, but which hadn't gone far. And able seaman Patrick O'Brien, the religious man who'd led prayers in the galley, swore that he could occasionally still hear the faintest whisper of that impossible melody, not in his ears but somewhere deeper in his bones or his blood, as if once you'd heard the song even briefly, some part of you would always be listening for it, always waiting for it to call you home to depths where light had never reached, and where things older than human memory swam in cold eternal darkness, dreaming dreams that mortal minds couldn't comprehend, but which somehow included us, as if we'd always been part of something vast and ancient that most of us had simply forgotten, and that forgetting was perhaps the only thing that kept us safe and sane and standing on dry land, instead of walking voluntarily into the sea with smiles on our faces and tears of joy frozen on our cheeks. The official Royal Navy records filed on March 22, 1943, told a story of heroic naval combat, stripped of every element that might challenge conventional reality. HMS Relentless had engaged German U-boat U-227 in the Black Gap region while investigating distress signals from SS Margaret, a Norwegian cargo vessel that had been torpedoed and was sinking with all hands. And during the subsequent depth charge attack, the destroyer had sustained damage from a retaliatory torpedo that had killed 47 crew members instantly and wounded dozens more, necessitating emergency medical evacuations and resulting in commendations for extraordinary valor under fire for Captain James Arthur Thornton and his surviving officers. The families of the affected crew members received their telegrams with black borders, respectful condolences from the Admiralty, and pension payments that were slightly more generous than standards, as if someone in the bureaucracy felt guilty about the lies being told, but lacked the authority or courage to reveal the truth. Lieutenant William Carter was transferred immediately upon recovery to a desk position at Admiralty House in London, where his war record showed exemplary service, but where his security clearance had been quietly elevated to levels that prevented him from ever serving aboard another vessel. And colleagues noticed that he never went near windows that overlooked the Thames, never attended naval ceremonies held at dockside, and had developed a nervous habit of wearing cotton wool in his ears even in quiet rooms, as if trying to block out sounds that only he could hear. Seaman James Aldrich, the young man with acute hearing who'd been the first to succumb to the Projekt Sirenenlied's effects, was officially listed as having died of his injuries on March 18, 1943, and his parents in Liverpool received a posthumous medal for bravery, but in reality, he was alive and institutionalized in the Craiglockhart facility in Scotland, under the care of Dr. Theodore Winters, a psychiatrist who'd specialized in treating shell-shock cases during World War I, and who'd been recruited by naval intelligence specifically to study the survivors of what internal documents referred to only as North Atlantic acoustic incidents. Dr. Winters' confidential reports, which remained classified for 8 decades, described Aldrich's condition as a form of permanent auditory hallucination, resistant to all conventional treatments, wherein the patient maintains absolute conviction that he can still hear what he terms the deep song, emanating from any body of water larger than a bathtub, and demonstrates extreme psychological distress when prevented from approaching such water sources, though he simultaneously expresses terror of actually entering water, and has attempted suicide by drowning on 3 occasions, suggesting an internal conflict between compulsion and self-preservation that may never be resolved. Lieutenant Commander David Reynolds returned to his teaching position at Cambridge after the war, published well-regarded papers on naval tactics, and never once mentioned his service aboard HMS Relentless, though students noted that he refused to supervise any doctoral theses involving marine biology or oceanography, and would occasionally stop mid-lecture, tilt his head as if listening to something, and then resume teaching with visibly shaking hands. Dr. Philip Ashford, the ship's medical officer, was quietly retired from naval service in 1944 with a diagnosis of chronic anxiety disorder secondary to combat stress. Though his private journals, discovered after his death in 1967, contained hundreds of pages of obsessive notation about acoustic frequencies, deep ocean pressure effects on human neurology, and increasingly frantic speculation about whether the thing they'd encountered had been a natural phenomenon, a side effect of the German gas, or something else entirely, something that had always existed in the deepest parts of the ocean, and which the gas had simply allowed them to perceive. And his final journal entry, written the day before he took his own life with an overdose of barbiturates, consisted of a single sentence repeated over and over for 3 pages. "It's still calling, and someday I won't be strong enough to refuse." The 3 intact cylinders of Projekt Sirenenlied, retrieved from the SS Margaret before she was scuttled, were transported under armed guard to the Porton Down Chemical Weapons Facility in Wiltshire, where they were stored in a specially constructed underground vault that was subsequently sealed with concrete, marked with hazard warnings that deliberately obscured the true nature of what was contained within. And the access codes were divided among 3 different intelligence services to ensure that no single authority could authorize their reopening without interagency consensus that has never been achieved. Captain James Thornton continued commanding destroyers through the end of the war, was promoted to Rear Admiral, and served with distinction until his retirement in 1951. But his wife Eleanor noticed that he'd developed peculiar habits. He refused to eat seafood of any kind, would not allow their children to learn swimming, and insisted that their retirement home be built in the Cotswolds, as far from any coastline as it was possible to get in Britain. And on his deathbed in 1973, delirious with cancer medication, he reportedly grabbed the hand of his attending nurse and whispered, "Tell the Admiralty they need to keep monitoring those coordinates because it's still down there. It's always been down there, and someday someone's going to be stupid enough to go looking for it deliberately, instead of stumbling upon it by accident. And when that happens, God help us all, because I don't think artillery shells will frighten it away a second time." Submarine commanders operating in the North Atlantic are still issued classified orders to avoid that specific region of ocean at depths exceeding 200 meters. Orders that don't explain why, that simply state the restriction as absolute policy, and naval personnel who ask too many questions about those orders tend to find their security clearances reviewed and their career advancement opportunities mysteriously limited, because some truths are considered too dangerous to acknowledge openly. And the truth that something ancient and patient and utterly alien dwells in the crushing darkness of the abyssal plains, something that has been there since before human consciousness evolved, and which will likely remain there long after our species is extinct, something that calls occasionally in frequencies we can almost hear, and which promises a homecoming to depths where the pressure would liquefy human bodies, but where perhaps consciousness might persist in forms we cannot imagine, is apparently one of those truths that